My name is Patrick Hines. I'm Senior Manager of Research Communities here at HAI, and really thrilled to have you for this final research seminar of the year. For today's seminar, I'm delighted to introduce Riana Pfefferkorm. Riana is a policy fellow here at HAI. She worked as a lawyer before coming to Stanford, and she's held several roles related to tech policy since she arrived at Stanford 10 years ago. Her research at HAI focuses on the harms caused by generative AI, particularly its impact on court proceedings, as well as harms related to child safety, which is the topic of today's seminar.
Thanks so much, Patrick, for that great intro. So as a content warning, I'm going to be talking today about child pornography, which is now commonly called child sex abuse material, or CSAM for short. I'm also going to be talking briefly about suicide and self-harm. Hopefully neither of those things is a surprise given the title of this talk. So I'm presenting a paper today that my former colleague Shelby Grossman and I published at the end of May. Shelby is now at Arizona State, where she is studying AI's impact on journalism. In previous research that she and I and a group of our Stanford colleagues had published last year about online child sexual exploitation and abuse, we had flagged the risk that generative AI might soon unleash a flood of AI-generated CSAM, or AI CSAM, as I call it in this paper. And that concern motivated this more recent phase of research investigating AI CSAM's effects on different domains of society. One of those domains in particular was children in K-12 schools. And I focused on that part of the paper for a shorter policy brief that I put out for HAI over the summer. Focuses on incidents in schools of students making and sharing what are often called deepfake nude images of other students. We have hard copies of that available on the table up here up front. Please take them with you. That's also available in PDF on our website. So when I say deepfake nudes, I'm referring to AI-generated or AI-altered sexually explicit imagery of a real individual. These are also called by other terminology: synthetic non-consensual imagery, synthetic non-consensual explicit imagery, synthetic non-consensual explicit AI-created imagery, etc. I typically see those summarized with acronyms that can be pronounced sneaky out loud, but those are all a mouthful, so I'll use deepfake nudes as terminology, which I suspect most folks may be more familiar with. And when deepfake nudes depict somebody under the age of 18, they also qualify as what I call AI CSAM because those images will typically meet the federal definition of what constitutes CSAM, or child pornography as the law still calls it. And I'm going to use both those terms, AI CSAM and deepfake nudes, in today's talk. So first, I'm going to provide some background on both the technology and the law that are in play here. Then I'll describe our research methodology before moving on to our findings. And then I'll close with proposals for what to do about this problem. So as some background, it helps to understand the basics of the AI CSAM issue. What is this? Where does it come from? Well, it takes a couple of different forms. Some AI CSAM is of completely imaginary children who do not exist at all in the real world. Other content is what is known as morphed imagery, meaning an innocuous image of a real identifiable child, somebody who really exists in the world, has been manipulated or morphed using AI into a sexually explicit image. And that's what we're going to focus on in this talk. There are a few ways that this material gets created. One way is through general purpose hosted models from big companies that offer image generation tools. And those are big mainstream companies. They have safety guardrails to try and prevent misuse for CSAM and for various other abusive purposes. Sometimes those guardrails can be circumvented by determined malicious actors. But between being a big hosted model from a big reputable mainstream company, having safety teams that are trying to prevent misuse, that isn't necessarily the biggest exponent for the creation of AI CSAM. Instead of hosted models, it's easier to abuse open source AI models, which run locally on somebody's computer. They can be tweaked and trained up by the user. They can be trained on data sets chosen by the user. And sometimes those training data sets include actual CSAM, either intentionally or inadvertently. So one of our colleagues put out research in 2023 showing that the open source diffusion model, Stable Diffusion 1.5, was being misused to create AI CSAM. That's an example of intentional misuse of an open source model. Like with hosted models, if you look at open source models, they also often have guardrails built in. But as a group of our HAI colleagues described in a policy brief last year, those guardrails can be removed, sometimes kind of inadvertently, just while you're trying to do something else by training the model, and that reintroduces safety risks that the model developers had tried to mitigate. So Stable Diffusion 1.5, which was the thing that David Thiel, our former colleague, had put out research about previously, had very easily removable guardrails. Plus, it had the latent capability to generate AI CSAM because it was trained on adult not safe for work content and on knowing what images of children look like. And the model could then combine the two to produce AI CSAM, sometimes when that wasn't even the goal of the person trying to prompt the model, sometimes wholly inadvertently, and then thereby produce sexually explicit imagery of children. It is also possible to inadvertently train on actual CSAM, as that same Stanford colleague David Thiel demonstrated when he found hundreds of instances of confirmed known CSAM in a very popular training data set called Lion5B, which was used widely by hobbyists, by researchers, academics, people who work in industry, and so on. Why was that in there? Well, that data set was assembled by scraping the open web. And if you don't clean your training data that you scraped from the open web, you're going to get CSAM in there because the open web, not just the dark web, also contains CSAM. Stable Diffusion 1.5, along with some other open source models, is what underpins a lot of the so-called nudify or undress apps that are responsible for the deepfake nude incidents in schools that I'm going to be talking about. So unlike general purpose image generation models that are just for creating any type of whatever image, nudify or undress apps are purpose-built just for this one reason of making deepfake nudes. All it takes is uploading one single clothed image of somebody, and you can get back an AI nudified image of that person that purports to digitally remove their clothing or to face swap somebody else's face onto the nude body. And other research and litigation has demonstrated that these apps do not consistently ban the upload of images of minors, either in their terms of service or in actual practice when you attempt to upload an image. These apps also stand out from the more general purpose open source models that can be locally trained in that they do all of that work for you as the user. So you don't require any kind of technical skills whatsoever. You don't have to learn how to use and train and fine tune an open source model by yourself. And so this ease of use and the lack of restrictions have made nudify apps an avenue for the quick, simple generation of AI CSAM, including by users who are themselves underage. It's so easy that even a kid can do it. And the name app is a little bit of a misnomer, a little imprecise, because some of these are downloadable apps that you find through an app store or that you sideload themselves, like through a website. Some of them work in the browser and they advertise online. And so you may find ads for these on social media, like on Instagram, for example. And in our research, we found that it's a real game of whack-a-mole for the app stores and for ad networks to try and crack down. Everybody bans these apps. You're not supposed to be allowed to advertise these or to run these in the app stores, but these apps have learned how to evade App Store review by obscuring the nudification functionality that they include and presenting themselves as general purpose image generation apps. And it has always been true of ad policy enforcement that there will be violative ads that get through the cracks at the sort of scale we're talking about with online advertising offered by major CDNs or by a company like Instagram. With that said, companies like Meta and Apple have been critiqued for still letting ads run or for letting some of these apps through the App Store in a way that commentators say that they should have the ability to detect them more effectively than they've been doing. Whether that's a resource problem or a willpower problem or a technical problem or a scale problem, that's not necessarily clear to me. It's not something I've studied in depth. But needless to say, these apps are like a many-headed hydra. And even if they get banned from the App Store, some sites will still work in the browser. And even if one site gets taken offline or deplatformed by the domain host, it may crop back up again under a different domain. And the reason that these things keep cropping back up like mushrooms after the rain is because they're very lucrative. They've been estimated to rake in tens of millions of dollars, according to an investigation by journalists, one of whom is a Cornell Tech professor who writes a newsletter called Indicator, which I know is going to run a big piece tomorrow, actually, on the nudify app ecosystem and what to do about it. So this is a way that kids may get exposed to nudify apps, is seeing an ad online on their social media app or somewhere else that slipped through ad policy enforcement on Instagram or whatever. And like I said, all you need is one picture of somebody, which you can pull off of her social media account or her mom or dad's social media account if they're posting pictures of their kids, or the website for the school soccer team that she's on, or you can take a picture of her in real life with your own phone, and then you are off to the races. So that's the technical overview of how this sort of material gets created. It also helps to know a bit about the laws underpinning CSAM. Federal law has long banned both real CSAM, meaning imagery or videos that depict an actual child who really exists actually being abused or in a sexually explicit pose, as well as what are known as morphed images, which, like I said, you use a computer or some other technique to convert an innocuous image of a real identifiable child into a sexually explicit image. In the past, that used to mean using Photoshop to like copy paste a kid's face onto an adult porn actor's body, for example. Now you can morph images using generative AI. But until recently, while federal law has long banned morphed imagery, a lot of states in their CSAM laws did not ban morphed images. And it took the advent of generative AI over the last 3 years to be a wake-up call that has since prompted dozens of states to pass laws just in the last couple of legislative sessions to criminalize AI CSAM, including morphed imagery, thereby closing that gap that a lot of them had in their laws. And then finally, there is another federal law that requires platforms to report apparent violations of federal CSAM laws. So if a platform finds what looks like CSAM on their service, whether it's real or whether it might potentially be AI, they are required to report it to a federally designated clearinghouse for those reports. And that law covers the newer crop of generative AI companies like OpenAI, alongside longstanding categories of service providers like social media, cloud storage, email, chat messaging services, and so on. So to say a little bit about our methodology, we wanted to study how prevalent is AI CSAM, how is it affecting different domains of society? And that meant trying to talk to a bunch of different stakeholders for our interviews. So between last June and February of this year, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 52 respondents, mostly but not all in the United States. We were not able to secure interviews with school leaders or with vendors who offer AI red teaming services. I'll note that we use the term victim in the paper and here. That's not necessarily always a favored word. Sometimes you hear words like survivor or subject of an image. We do use the word victim advisedly in our paper. I mentioned that there's a federal clearinghouse for receiving reports from online platforms. That clearinghouse is NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And so we were able to talk to a few victims, parent and lawyer of victims, to personnel at NCMEC, as well as a bunch of other stakeholders who are starting to see this potentially as a problem for them. In addition, thanks to sending out public records requests, we were able to get documents from 5 public school districts in California, New Jersey, Texas, and Washington, which we targeted because those schools had been in the news for having student-on-student deepfake nude incidents happen there. And news reporting and legislative trackers were really useful for us in locating state bills about AI CSAM that had been introduced over the last couple of legislative sessions. And that helped lead us to the people we reached out to as state legislators or state legislative staffers to try and get interviews with them as well. So what did we find? In terms of how common nudify incidents are in schools, we didn't actually come to any definitive conclusions. There was not a consensus among our respondents who, as noted, come from education, law enforcement, a variety of different professions. Some of them had not heard about this being a problem. Others believe prevalence is high. We had one respondent tell us there's going to be one kid in every single school who's making images of the other girls at school. And we don't know what to make of this lack of consensus. Maybe this is something that's still rare. Maybe it gets handled internally by and large within schools, and so it's hard to determine the true prevalence of these kinds of incidents. But with that said, there haven't been that many reported in the news with regard to student-on-student incidents. There are 54 million school children just in the United States alone. So if there's only a handful of news stories, even if we assume there's some larger number than that that are handled internally and don't make it into the news, we still think it's probably safe to infer against that huge student population in the United States that this is probably still not overwhelmingly prevalent at the moment. And that means that schools now have the chance to try and get out ahead of this problem and get prepared for it. Because right now, it seems like schools are not prepared to deal with nudify incidents. Our interviews suggested to us that schools are not currently addressing the risks of nudify apps with their students. Several respondents told us that schools often provide instruction on online exploitation, on online risks, only reactively after an incident has already happened, rather than addressing it proactively. And in particular, we got the impression that when it comes to AI, schools and school administrators and teachers are still on the level of only being aware of AI as something that students might use to cheat, or that school teachers might use to help them prepare their lesson plans, that kind of thing, rather than this more advanced awareness of the potential of sexual exploitation risks leveraging AI. That said, we did only interview one actual teacher, and I will note there's other research on this issue that was published by the ACM pretty shortly before our paper, where the interview respondents were all teachers. And none of those respondents reported knowledge of actual cases at their own schools, but some reported that it was coming up in school trainings. So I don't want to make it sound like no schools are addressing this yet in trainings. Nevertheless, it seems like this is something that's still seen as being on the horizon, rather than something that has overwhelmed schools already so far. And we found, looking at some of these incidents where this has happened in real cases, that schools often struggle to respond correctly to a student-on-student deepfake nude incident. Teachers often lack training in how to deal with this. Schools are apt to not have a crisis management plan in place for this kind of circumstance. And if we look at news reports and we look at litigation stemming from some of these incidents, schools have sometimes failed to timely report nudify incidents to the appropriate authorities. That might be due to ambiguity in states' mandatory reporter laws, as I'll discuss shortly. It could be due to school personnel's insufficient knowledge of state law, or some respondents suggested to us that schools have an incentive just to try and sweep these incidents under the rug and find some way to avoid having to report it externally. So that's external. Internally, schools, we find, may be slow to act after a student or a parent tips them off about a nudify incident. The school may be more focused on disciplining the accused perpetrator rather than providing support for the victims. And we found that the victim's trauma is exacerbated when a school botches the response. So when schools mishandle a nudify incident, it destroys the trust of the victims, of their families, of their friends at school, and other members of the school community. So you might be wondering to yourself, why would kids do this to each other? Why would anybody make and share deepfake nudes of their peers? And we have interview respondents coming from a bunch of different fields. We talked to people with neuroscience expertise, people who work in criminal justice, and so on. And they described a real spectrum of intents and motivations for this kind of behavior. On one end, it might be sheer curiosity about what another kid's body looks like. It might be a teenager who has a crush on somebody and is fantasizing about that girl. Some kids might think it's funny or think that it's a harmless prank to play on another kid. And then on the more blameworthy end of the scale, for some kids, nudifying their peers' images is a form of bullying, either maybe to pick on somebody who's already a social outcast, or maybe after somebody has a falling out with their friend. In the ACM research that I mentioned, there was an instance of girls bullying other girls by making deepfake nudes of them, although by and large, this is usually boy-on-girl conduct based on the interviews we did and on the incidents that have been reported in the news. It could be intentionally malicious behavior, for example, to get back at an ex-girlfriend after a breakup as a form of intimate partner violence. And still others might engage in malicious at-scale generation of dozens of girls in their school, even of female teachers at their school as well, or they may do it for sextortion purposes, although the use of imagery to try and extort a child seems to be something that is pretty vanishingly rare in the student-on-student context, as opposed to adults trying to extort a child. We did hear again and again and again from our respondents that kids just don't have the same cognitive development level that adults do. So they can't fully understand the potential consequences of their actions. They can't fully comprehend how harmful this conduct is to the victim. They aren't necessarily capable at the age of 12, 13, 14 years old of thinking 3 steps ahead and understanding that sharing an image with one other person might lead to that person sharing it with one other person, and that it might then spread virally out of control well beyond what the kid intended for it to happen. And then besides the cognitive development issue, these kids are still on a journey of social development. They're learning how to navigate relationships, how to develop empathy. They're making mistakes in their interactions with other people. That's a normal part of development, is making mistakes and being mean to your friends and learning how to recover from that. But this is a particularly damaging potential manifestation of that. And we also heard from some of our respondents that digital interactions can seem less real or material or consequential to kids than face-to-face interactions. So somebody might be mean to their friends online in a way that they would never do that if they were face-to-face. So with that variety of motivations and recognition of the fact that kids are not just miniature adults, we see that rationale underpinning the lack of consensus among our respondents about the appropriate consequences for students who engage in this activity. A lot of them were really skeptical of criminal charges, and they brought up other alternatives like counseling, educational interventions, or school transfer. And then on the other hand, we had other respondents who favored criminal prosecution, who rejected the framing of this is just kids making mistakes and making bad decisions. One of them even said, hey, this is a very adult nature of a crime, and it's an adult crime. You should treat the kid who offends like an adult. After all, we're talking about making and disseminating child pornography, which is a serious crime. And morphing a kid's image like this is against the law for very good reasons. There's this pernicious myth, even including among the responses of some school personnel that we saw in some of the reported incidents, that if there's no hands-on abuse, then how harmful can AI nudes really be, really? And we debunk that narrative right up front in our paper. So being depicted without your consent in a deepfake nude, especially if you're a child, but also if you're an adult, carries a variety of harms. It's an extreme privacy violation of your own privacy and intimacy. It causes psychological and emotional harms to the person who is depicted, which can then lead to impact on not attending school consistently. It can lead to lower grades. It can affect participation in other activities that the student previously enjoyed. The student may also express fear about reputational risks. They may think or know that other kids at the school are gossiping about them, that other kids have seen them naked, even though it's not really them naked. And we heard multiple times through our interviews about a fear that these images are going to keep cropping up and following them around online, and that they will be found when the kid is applying to college, when they're trying to apply for jobs in the future, when they want to go on a date with somebody or make a friendship, that these images are just going to keep hounding them throughout their lives. And even in the extreme instance, it can be suicide or self-harm consequences to being depicted in a deepfake nude. Like I said, this is almost exclusively something that usually gets done to girls and to women. The exception actually is the sextortion fact pattern. There it is more usually teenage boys who are the targets, and they're usually being targeted by cybercriminal gangs, often located abroad in another country entirely, who are targeting kids. And it used to be, before the advent of generative AI and these nudify apps, that a sextortion fact pattern happened where first a cybercriminal would pose as somebody else who's age appropriate, maybe pose as a girl who's interested in a boy, and gradually fool them into sending a real nude of himself to the cybercriminal, who then flips over to the extortion script and threatens to release the image to the school or the parents or friends or whoever, unless the kid pays up. Now that you have generative AI and nudify apps, sextortionists don't even have to do that first, tricking them and lulling them into thinking that they're on their side anymore. They can just go straight into saying, I have this nude image of you, and unless you pay me, I'm going to release it to your friends or family. And as a result, we have seen multiple instances where, sadly, boys have taken their own lives after being sextorted with either real or deepfake nudes. And that's different from our student-on-student scenario, but I want to mention it because it illustrates that even though that's maybe relatively rare, it can have potentially extremely severe consequences for the person who is being affected. And I do want to give some quotes that we published in the paper that we garnered either through our interviews or through the public records that we got. So we had one victim tell us, "You feel so out of control." There was a parent who told us, "You can see that somebody might really believe that that was her naked," speaking about her daughter who had been victimized in this way. We had a victim who wrote in a public records response that we got saying, "I was unable to concentrate or feel safe at school." And also in public records requests, there was an email from a parent saying she's been dealing with extreme anxiety and panic attacks. She's currently home avoiding school, completely anxiety stricken. So those are all illustrations from actual cases of the kinds of harms that being depicted in a deepfake nude can cause to these students. So what should we do about it? The good news is that because these sorts of incidents don't seem to have become overwhelmingly prevalent yet, now is the time that schools can prepare to get out in front of the issue. For one thing, a lot of schools already have an important resource in place, even if they might not realize it. Our research found that schools' anonymous tip lines have turned out in multiple instances to be an important means for surfacing nudify incidents to school administrators. These sorts of tip lines may be encouraged or even required by state law. So, for example, California a couple of years ago passed a mandatory tip line law in response to a school shooting in Southern California. And they're usually intended for school safety purposes, for reporting harassment, intimidation, bullying, hey, I saw Timmy bring a gun to campus today, that kind of thing, in a way that lets students stay anonymous in reporting so that they don't have to be afraid that they're going to be seen as tattletales by their peers. But we found incidents where students repurposed these tip lines to report nudify incidents. Hey, so-and-so went on this girl's Instagram and pulled off a picture of her and these two other girls from homecoming, and then somehow he managed to make a nudified version that has all their clothes off, and then he's been circulating it around on Snapchat groups. So that is an important means of reporting, both for victims who might fear being victim blamed. If they try and come forward about this, they might fear adults freaking out on them and not being helpful if they went directly to a parent or to a teacher. And it's also important for bystanders who want to be what my friend, the legal scholar Zach Kaufman, calls upstanders. Somebody who witnesses an incident happening and wants to stand up and do the right thing and just needs a channel where they can feel safe doing that. The one caveat that I will add is that schools have to take these tips seriously. We saw an incident in our research where the administrator who handled incoming tips allegedly just blew off a tip that had been sent in about a student nudifying other kids' pictures. And so that delayed addressing the problem. It delayed dealing with the perpetrator and stopping them from potentially making more images of other girls. It delayed providing help to the victims. And it was extremely detrimental to trust at the school. Students aren't going to use a tip line if they think you're just going to ignore the tips. So while we find that these tip lines can be really useful to surface these incidents, they're only as useful as the appropriate follow-up that actually happens. We also recommend preparing a policy for dealing with these incidents in advance. Prepare what the plan for responding is going to be. Train your personnel in that policy, in the plans, in what resources there are available to support the victims, to support the community, what sort of disciplinary and counseling resources or rehabilitative options are there for the accused offender, and so on. Not to mention having a plan for how to deal with the potentially conflicting goals of preserving evidence of wrongdoing, something that might potentially be a crime, versus the victim-centric goal of deleting the images wherever they have ended up and trying to stop the spread of them from spreading out further. Like I said, one of the things we found is that a botch response exacerbates victim trauma, deeply undermines trust in the school, not just on the part of the victims and their families, but other students, even teachers who see the school as having failed the victims may end up siding with the students and with the victims over the school that's employing them. And we've seen school communities be completely torn apart after a school responds incorrectly. And that's the kind of thing that you can prepare for in advance so that you're not just scrabbling around trying to figure out what to do in the moment. We also recommend figuring out how are you going to educate students about these risks. Our respondents flagged the risk of specifically telling curious teenage kids, hey, there's this thing out there that exists, but it's really bad and you should never visit this website and you should never do anything with this. That might potentially blow up in your face and backfire. So instead, it's possible to just try and respond by teaching kids a more broad-based education in consent, dignity, personal privacy, having respect for other children. And you can start that very young in an age-appropriate way and continue with that kind of reinforcement of learning in age-appropriate ways as they continue to grow. And in fact, one heartening thing that we saw in the public records that we got back was an instance where we got all of the witness interview notes that a school had done with all of the kids at a school who had either seen the images or had been victimized or were accused of perpetrating it. And what we saw in these interviews was an emergent narrative that the kid who had made these images was showing them to other kids on his phone at school. And without fail, these other kids all responded, dude, that's not cool. That's not okay. What are you doing? And it seemed like the kid immediately was like remorseful or sorry about what he had done. It wasn't necessarily the response that he might have expected. It's not clear, was he doing this because he thought it was funny? Did he think it would somehow make him look cool in the eyes of the other kids? But the kids responded the right way. this is not okay. This is not cool to do to another person. And we don't know, is that something that they got from sex ed in school? Was it something that they had instilled in them by their parents? We don't know. But it's an example of how kids took an approach of consent, privacy, respect, dignity, and applied it to some particular new situation, new circumstance that they had not previously been specifically told about, but they still had the right response. And so that's, at least one data point in favor of this more broad-based type of education over making specific warnings. With that said, neither my co-authors and I are early childhood education experts or sex ed experts, so we don't necessarily recommend taking one path over the other of specific education versus this more broad-based approach. We just want to flag that this is something that schools need to be deciding what they are planning to do about it. And then as a final note, it is very in vogue right now to ban phones from the classroom during the school day. Most schools also filter the internet access in order to keep students from visiting unwanted websites while they are on the school's Wi-Fi network or using school resources. That's not necessarily going to fix everything, because even if a student has a school-issued device to use during the school day, or even if they have to put their phones in a cubby or something during the day, they're going to have more unfettered internet access on their own devices when they're outside of the school environment. Or if they have devices that don't have all of the filters and stuff installed on them on their own personal devices. So merely implementing these sorts of phone bans and internet filtering is not going to completely mitigate this potential misuse of nudify apps by your students. For what parents can do, this is, again, some of the same things as for schools, teaching kids about consent and privacy and respect and dignity, and teaching them that images is included in that. Whether that's sexual images of another kid or any image that's trying to bully or ridicule another kid, respect for your fellow peers encompasses imagery of them. And we also want to make sure that kids feel safe speaking up if they are either witness as a bystander to an incident like this, or if they are themselves victimized. Like I said, we don't want kids to try and do the right thing and report that this is happening, only to have a parent freak out at them or blame a girl for being the reason that this happened and doing victim blaming to her, or trying to worry over much about the potential consequences for somebody who has witnessed this instance. We want kids to feel psychologically safe and know that their parents have their backs in helping them report and bring this problem to attention. Like I said, a lot of schools have school safety tip lines. You don't necessarily know as a parent if that's already available. Does your kid know that it's there? Do you know how to use it? So we would recommend finding that tip line and teaching your kid how to use it, or at least making sure that they are aware of it in case that or any other sort of threat happens at school. And then, like I adverted to at the top, some of the time this might be a situation where somebody takes a picture themselves in person or pulls an image off of the kid's own social media account. But parents also have a role to play here, because a lot of the time, frankly, parents post their own kids online, whether that kid has consented to it or not, even as they get older and may have more of an opinion about whether they are okay with that happening. We are starting now, I think, to see more of a trend where more and more parents will either only post pictures of their kids where their face is not visible and they're facing away from the camera, or where you can use an app to add an emoji or blur or something to obscure the kid's face to make it less easy for somebody to use a kid's image in this way. In fact, I also just saw a public service announcement from Ireland where one of the Irish government agencies had made an ad that featured two parents taking their kids to the mall. And they keep meeting all of these adult strangers in the mall who address the kid familiarly. Oh, I see you're over your cold. Oh, you did a great job at the gymnastics meet. And now everybody's looking at this how do they know all of that? And it's a good illustration. It ends with saying, stop putting your kid's face everywhere online. And so it is good to see now that these kinds of interventions are being targeted at the role that parents have in mitigating this new potential threat to their own kids. And then another thing that you can do is, like I was saying, a lot of schools are not prepared for this yet. And probably the most direct contact that a lot of parents have is through a PTA or through attending school board meetings. And you would have some ability to talk to your kids' schools. Even if you don't necessarily want to talk about nudify apps specifically with your kid, you can go to their school and say, what are you going to do about this potential problem? What are you going to do to prevent this before it happens to you? And are you training your staff? For state lawmakers, there's a lot of dissent and lack of consensus, like I said, about what the justice system should do with kids who make and share deep fake news. Dozens of states, like I said, have passed laws in recent years that expressly ban AI CSAM, but very few of those contemplated that children would be the offenders, not just the victims. And even our legislative respondents, when we did interviews with legislators and their staffs, they said this just wasn't on our radar as a potential fact pattern, which means that almost none of the laws that have been passed say what to do when the offender is themselves a minor. Like I said, a lot of interview respondents were really skeptical of criminalization, and rightly so. We heard again and again that kids have a range of motivations and that their brains are not fully developed yet. And so treating a 13-year-old the same as an adult who creates this kind of material is frankly just not appropriate. In figuring out the right approach, legislators should consult with the experts in this field. They should talk to educators, including those who are skilled in trauma-informed pedagogy. They should talk to child psychologists, juvenile justice advocates, victims advocates, and so on. And some states have in fact passed AI CSAM laws requiring behavioral health counseling or educational programs for young or first-time offenders, including South Carolina, which recently passed a law stating that this kind of an offense is a misdemeanor that will get heard in family court if it's a minor and somebody who has no past record. This is a first-time offense. And then the court has the option to order behavioral health counseling from an appropriate agency or appropriate behavioral health provider as a condition of adjudicating that matter, instead of just locking them up and throwing away the key. And it's vital for lawmakers to consider other options besides criminal punishment. The United States already jails children at a higher rate than I think almost every other country in the world. And the juvenile justice system, we have lots of research showing that it does lasting damage to the youth who pass through it. So the answer to traumatize kids is not traumatizing more kids. Right now, so far, criminalization doesn't seem to be a common response to students who engage in this conduct. I'm only aware of 4 cases from 4 different states in which minors have been criminally charged for making deepfake nudes of their peers. But with that said, one of the difficulties of researching this issue is that juvenile justice matters and student discipline matters are heavily protected by privacy laws for very, very good reason, but it means that it's hard to find out very much about like the ultimate disposition of what happens if kids get implicated in the juvenile justice system at all, and what else happens to them as a result of school discipline, and are there any sorts of patterns that we can tell about the kinds of kids who are more or less likely to either offend or to be victims of this kind of conduct. So it is possible, based on those limitations, that there are more cases that I just don't know about besides the 4 that I do know about. The second thing that we recommend for state lawmakers to do is to clarify their state mandatory reporter laws. As you may be aware, there are various entities and individuals who are designated as mandatory reporters under various state laws, who, if they see child abuse, including child sex abuse, will have to report that out to the appropriate agencies. But it's not clear whether the definition of sexual abuse under state mandatory reporter laws covers nudifying images, where there's no hands-on contact that ever happens necessarily with the victim. And so this has led to confusion among school personnel. And one of the reasons that it's such a gray area is that some states' laws do already encompass this potentially, and some states' laws don't necessarily. Our paper compares and contrasts news stories from a school in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where the district attorney ultimately determined that the school had not violated any law by failing to report the incident, compared with an incident in Washington outside of Seattle, where the police came to a school after it took parents reporting to the police because the students had said, we're not seeing anything happening, the school's not doing anything. And the police showed up and said, why didn't you report this? And the school personnel said, well, what was there to report? And the police said, you have to report this under our state's like mandatory reporter laws. So that illustrates the sort of ambiguity in these laws. That Pennsylvania incident recently spurred the Pennsylvania state senator who had sponsored that state's AI CSAM law to introduce a bill that would add unlawful dissemination of intimate images to the child-on-child contact portion of the state's mandatory reporter law. And that bill is currently in progress right now through the state legislature. One of the things that is also variable in state mandatory reporter laws is that some of them require reporting to a child welfare services agency, others require reporting to the police. And so that ties back to what I was saying about criminalization not potentially being the right answer. If a school has to call the police under the mandatory reporter law, is that potentially going to just make things worse by now implicating a child into the criminal justice system? And so that's why we don't say in the paper exactly how states should amend their mandatory reporter laws, just that they ought to do it in such a way that it becomes clear to anybody for whom this happens at their school what their obligations are or are not. Do they have to report it or do they not? Another thing that is a little bit short of like full criminalization would be to add the creation and sharing of deepfake nudes or the non-consensual sharing of real nude images to a state's definition of cyberbullying. Most states have laws in place requiring that schools within the state's jurisdiction has to have a policy in place and define which behaviors count as bullying. Those are usually set forth under the state law, what counts as bullying. If you added deepfake nude creation and sharing to the bullying definition, then states will have to prepare in advance because there's already laws on the books telling them that they have to have bullying policies ready. So that would be one way, short of passing another whole law just for deepfake news, to say, you have to have this be part of your prep for when something goes wrong with your students at school. And that could potentially be a less severe alternative to criminalization if this is defined as bullying and if the state law defines what are the disciplinary consequences available to the school for this kind of bullying. There was a Texas law bill proposed this year that didn't end up becoming law, but that would have added to the bullying definition both the non-consensual dissemination of fake nudes as well as real nudes. And that's worth noting, is that a lot of these options are also available if students non-consensually share onward a real nude image that a student had shared with that student in confidence. You can make those changes to the mandatory reporter law as well, not just to the bullying law. That bipartisan consensus on child safety that motivated the passage of so many state laws on AI CSAM in recent years has also been on display in the federal Congress, where child safety has been a really big watchword in the last couple of sessions. In fact, one of the few significant laws that Congress has passed this year is a law called the Take It Down Act. This criminalizes non-consensually publishing real or deepfake nudes, whether of an adult or of a minor, as well as threatening publication of them. It will require platforms to remove reported non-consensual intimate imagery, real or deepfake, adult or minor, within 48 hours of a report once that takedown requirement goes into effect next May. The law included a 1-year delay of that going into effect so that platforms have time to get their systems ready to prepare. And that May passage came after we did all of our interviews, so we didn't talk about this law, which was just a bill at the time, with our respondents. There's a little evidence that either this law or some changes in other countries' laws dealing with AI CSAM may have been linked to at least one really notorious deepfake nudify site shutting down earlier this year. But a lot of nudify apps are located abroad, and a lot of those are still online right now. Unsurprisingly, it's really difficult for American justice to try and reach companies that are located abroad. And it's still early days, so it's too soon to tell what effect the Take It Down Act is going to have on student nudify incidents. It's not going to be invoked to prosecute anybody under the age of 18 because the federal government does not prosecute minors, with some very rare exceptions, like for terrorism, for example. Otherwise, juvenile justice is almost exclusively a matter that's left up to the states. With that said, Take It Down may act as a deterrent, along with all of the state laws I've been talking about criminalizing AI CSAM that might potentially dissuade kids from making and sharing deepfake nudes of each other, at least so long as kids are educated that that is the law, which is something that parents and schools can communicate to them to impress the serious potential consequences of this behavior. And then if an image is shared, then once the takedown requirements go into effect, the victim will be able to report it to platforms and have it be removed once those provisions go into effect. Some platforms actually already participate in a couple of initiatives for taking down non-consensual intimate imagery when the person depicted reports it. There's separate initiatives for if the person depicted is over 18 versus under 18. And like I said at the top, in discussing the laws in this area, there's already the reporting law in place that says that if a platform encounters a parent CSAM, they have to take it offline and report it to the NCMEC clearinghouse. So that's already one way that this material can come down. But these report and takedown requirements will add another avenue for victims to get their imagery taken offline, which should at least help address the fear that I mentioned earlier about these images are going to follow me around for the rest of my life. They're going to be found by employers and colleges and so on and so forth. Even though with all of these laws that have been passed at the state level and at the federal level to ban AI CSAM, there is still more work for Congress to do. Probably the biggest policy gap that our research identified is the need for the federal government to clear a legal path to enable the responsible, good faith red teaming of generative AI models for their capacity to produce AI CSAM. Now, there's two sides to trying to improve model safety against AI CSAM. One is, can you clean the data and take out any apparent CSAM so that you're not training the model directly on actual abuse imagery? And the other is, can you prompt the model to produce CSAM? Can you jailbreak it, try to break the safeguards and circumvent the safeguards that you also built into it? Because you want to build in those safeguards, and then you want to be able to test them for their efficacy. And even if it's not directly trained on CSAM, does this thing have the latent capacity to produce it? How good are your guardrails? So that's a question both of the training data and of how the model behaves. Now, like I said, all of the big model companies that have hosted models for general purpose generation, they're not the primary channel by which AI CSAM gets created. That's mostly open source models like Stable Diffusion 1.5, which form the basis for these nudify apps. But for those hosted models, which after all are popular with kids, just like they're popular with everybody else, it's not like they want to become known as the one-stop shop for making AI CSAM. Nobody wants that business reputation, especially not when you're chasing a $500 billion valuation or trying to get billions of dollars of investment. And as we saw with the Lion 5B debacle, AI CSAM risk stemming from training data or from model behavior is also something that the open source AI community needs to be concerned with as well. So when we did our research, some of the respondents we talked to are people who work at AI companies, typically ones who work at hosted model companies. And we found that AI companies and the people working there face real legal risks and legal uncertainty around red teaming their models for their CSAM generation capacity. And that's because intent does not matter when it comes to CSAM production and possession. There's no, oh, well, but I meant well defense to these CSAM offenses. If you assemble a training data set that contains CSAM, like with Lion 5B, you might fear that if you try and report that, you might be accused of going out and trying to intentionally gather up CSAM and then be found to be in possession of it. And if you try and test a model to trick it into producing CSAM, you're afraid that you might be accused of attempting to produce CSAM, and production of CSAM is a crime. And then if you succeed, now you possess it as well, and that's also a separate crime. And so from our interviews, we learned companies do not want that liability. Employees aren't interested in going to prison for their jobs. The federal government does not want careless red teamers out there potentially generating this kind of material and not safeguarding it correctly. And nobody wants bad actors having the ability to hide behind the excuse of, no, I'm not a malicious actor. I was just red teaming. So what is it that AI companies are actually doing to try and red team their models? One of our respondents told us that around 2023, AI CSAM red teaming was being outsourced, but that there's been a recent shift towards bringing it in-house. We were not able to verify or falsify that claim because we were not able to do interviews with people who work at AI red teaming companies, who after all will red team AI models for their capacity to do a variety of other things, cyber, nuclear type risks, that kind of thing, right? So based on our interviews, we think that there's probably some companies that aren't making any effort to red team their models for CSAM at all. There may be others who are just directly trying to prompt the model and are just relying on the low likelihood of being caught and prosecuted for doing so. Right now, the best practice, as published by a child safety tooling org called Thorn, and that has been adopted by multiple AI companies, is to test for a model's capacity to generate adult sexual content, test for its ability to create clothed images of children, and infer that if it knows both of those things, it could combine those concepts to generate AI CSAM. Basically taking the lesson from Stable Diffusion 1.5, where that was the problem, that it had not safe for work content in the training data, as well as clothed images of children, and thereby was able to produce AI CSAM inadvertently. But the respondents that we talked to were really frustrated by the limitations of this indirect approach to trying to test their model, because they know that the malicious actors who are adversarially trying to get their model to create CSAM are not doing that with one hand tied behind their backs, the way that the red teamers are having to do. And so now, happily, we are starting to see some recognition by policymakers that red teaming is an issue. So there's a bill that was introduced in Congress with bipartisan sponsorship in July, inspired by the Stanford Lion 5B research I mentioned, that would require NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, to issue voluntary best practices for how to clean training data for CSAM and grant limited legal liability to training data set creators and to AI model developers if they follow those best practices, so that they can feel safe about reporting anything bad that they find in their training data. And then in the UK, just very recently, recognizing that intentionally trying to create AI CSAM is also illegal generally under UK law, they just passed a new law that will give designated AI companies and child safety organizations permission to examine AI models for their CSAM capacity. I'm not going to claim exactly what I think what the policy ought to be, like the precise wording of what these laws ought to be, but I just want to underscore the urgency of figuring out a way forward here. One of the other topics that I've written about in the time I've been at Stanford is the legal risks to good faith cybersecurity researchers who find security vulnerabilities in software or hardware and firmware, and then report them to the vendors before disclosing it to the public, so that the vendors can fix that problem before the person who found it goes public and says, we found a security vulnerability. And in the cybersecurity field, good faith researchers spent years hampered by the chilling effect of being afraid of being sued or prosecuted under state and federal anti-hacking laws. And it took over a decade for the Department of Justice to establish a policy in 2022 of not prosecuting good faith cybersecurity research as criminal hacking. It took over a decade. We are moving at a really fast clip when it comes to AI image generation. We cannot afford to take as long here as we did there to try and find a way to provide a safe legal harbor for good faith AI red teamers who are trying to help make models safer against this particular type of abuse. It's a really hard topic to legislate, like any topic involving children can be, but it has been really heartening to see how bipartisan of an issue that this has been during what's otherwise a really deeply politically divided era. And so I'm optimistic that schools and policymakers can seize on this opportunity to get ahead of the issue while there is still time. Thanks again for listening. Here are the URLs to the full paper and to the policy brief. As a reminder, we have hard copies here in the room. Please take them with you. And now we can open it up for Q&A.
Thank you for your presentation. It's obviously a very sensitive topic. I wanted to ask a question on the suggestions you had for the lawmakers, and I was curious about strong age verification for adult content or any apps or websites that would allow you to create anything that could be considered adult content. Why was that not proposed, or is that also being proposed? Because then even if minors are involved, if there's strong age verification, that would probably prevent them from being able to access those sites or those apps. And if also there was strong penalties for providing adult content or generating adult content without properly vetting the age, then that would also fall upon now the model AI model companies and whatnot to do much better jobs of cleaning up the training data that you're talking about, much better jobs of red teaming, because they would get caught in this net of, well, now you can produce adult content, and now all of a sudden you have to put a gate on age verification. But if you don't produce that kind of content, that gate is not required. So I think this would be a much better way to clean up this mess.
So I am a deep, deep skeptic of age verification in general. And that's beyond really the scope of the time we have here, but there are significant privacy and security downsides as well as expression downsides. I'm a strong believer in the right to anonymously receive and provide information. All of those are undermined by age verification. We saw an absolutely disastrous hack and leak of over 70,000 global users of Discord of the age verification information that they had provided, like biometric details, your ID card. That's only going to happen more and more as we see more age verification mandates get passed in different states around the country and around the world. So I am not a big proponent of age verification whatsoever. I also think it's a little bit orthogonal to this particular issue because the issue isn't the age of the person who is creating non-consensual deepfake nudes. The issue is that it's non-consensual deepfake nudes. And like I said, a lot of these nudify apps don't even use some of the known best practices for trying to detect a child's image being uploaded. So if we're focused on the CSAM component of it, the thing that needs to be done is to ensure that it's not like kids' nude images as an absolute like low-hanging fruit to keep that sort of material from being generated. But whoever creates it, whether it's another student, whether it's an adult, the problem isn't the age of the person making it. So I don't think that this is really the thing that age verification is responsive to. I recognize that a lot of people disagree with me about age verification's utility in general. To your point about whether there should be more impositions on platforms themselves, I mean, look, the good faith platforms are already trying to do this. The problem is the nudify apps that do not care if they are violating the law. We are starting to see some expansion of trying to impose legal liability on service providers to deepfake nude services. California just passed a first in the nation law that would penalize companies like AWS or Cloudflare, whoever that provides services to deepfake nudify services if they are put on notice and don't then cut off those services as customers. That seems like it has a lot of utility in trying to potentially scare away the service providers to these kinds of apps. But I also think that it is a very dangerous slippery slope, because if we start to say we can then threaten the service providers that are at the next level down of the stack and tell them you have to deplatform this or that or the other service or else you will be legally liable. I have a lot of fear about that because it could be used against any other type of speech. I don't see what the limiting principle is against just targeting it to nudify apps. But we will see what happens now that California has this law in place. I think it has some other problems. I think it's in conflict with a different federal law that I don't have time to discuss. But all of that is to say, not a proponent of age verification in general because of the security, privacy, and expression consequences of it. And I don't think it's necessarily the most direct way to address this particular type of harm. But thank you, it's a really good question. Yeah.
So before I ask my question, I agree with your answer to age verification. So I'm going to follow up with that with a different question. So it seems to me that the main issue is consent. So
Correct.
Why not go after the people who produce images without the consent of those images, meaning the parents, meaning the directors of, I mean, all these laws are based on an era where they were printed in the newspapers, predated the internet. We're now in a different era. So if you are somebody who's producing the picture of anyone, whether it's a child, whether it's somebody incapacitated, an elderly, without that person's explicit consent, you should be punished. We already do that for financial decisions. We do that for a lot of things, whether you're the parent, the guardian, the director of, I don't know what we like to this approach as opposed to the age verification one, which is, you know, I agree with what you said.
Yeah. I mean, so this is the issue is, shouldn't we be targeting the people who are doing the creation? And we are starting to see that. So the Take It Down Act provides a civil cause of action, like under federal law, that victims could try and sue the person who is responsible for making their images and sharing their images. We're starting to see lawsuits that already started being filed even before that law got passed, where at least in one notorious case in New Jersey, the girl who had her image nudify is suing the kid who did it in federal court on various theories. It's not clear that necessarily like scales. And after all, it's not like kids and their parents are going to have as deep of pockets as like a Google or an AWS or Cloudflare, which is why I think we see a lot of emphasis, not just on like what level can you try and cut this off most effectively, but who has the deepest pockets to try and recover from them. With that said, when you mentioned like, why are we not going after the parents? When we were doing our interviews, we talked to somebody who said that they really think we are going to see a wave of litigation that will try and hold parents responsible legally when their kids nudify images of other kids. In that New Jersey case, when a minor sues or is sued, basically their parents have to appear sort of on their behalf. So it's not the parents being sued directly, it's kid versus kid. But the respondent we spoke to said, we're starting to see cases where school shooting victims' families are starting to successfully hold the parents of the school shooter responsible. And so that respondent thought maybe we will start to see more of those sorts of instances trying to hold the parent responsible when their kids engage in this kind of in kind of conduct. So that remains to be seen, but it was interesting. Certainly, I can tell you from looking at some of the cases that have been filed so far, and just from being a former attorney myself, plaintiffs' attorneys have a big incentive to try and find ways to try and hold families or platforms or whoever accountable on whatever theory they can find. So I think we will probably see a lot of creative types of trying to impose legal liability on different players within this whole ecosystem. I live in San Francisco. The San Francisco city attorney has been successful in filing a lawsuit last year against a bunch of nudify apps themselves. Actually, some of them are abroad, and so he's had trouble even like serving the lawsuit on them. But at least one of them was located within the U.S. jurisdiction, and he was able to get a settlement with that company that resulted in 10 sites getting taken offline. And that was without having the Take It Down Act. That's without having the law I just mentioned for going after deepfake pornography services and the companies that provide services to them. He was able to use the state's general purpose consumer protection law to go after those states. So I think we will probably see a lot of creativity like that, in addition to trying to take advantage of some of the new laws that we are seeing getting passed that try to provide either criminal penalties or civil liability routes for various players at different levels of the stack, including potentially parents. Yeah, great question.
Okay, let me take a couple of questions online. So you actually covered quite a bit of this in the talk, which is dead on there. Couple things. While this focused on K through 12, have you seen anything related to the response at the university level? And if so, have you seen anything related to developing policies at the college university level with respect to this question?
We didn't study the university context. I'm aware of at least one like criminal prosecution of like a college student for nudifying images of other college students. I think he also was nudifying images of like a 17-year-old. And like the moment you go under 18, like you're screwed, man. They're going to throw the book at you because that's child pornography. I'm not aware of efforts like at the university context because that was just not our research population. But that said, like probably multiple of the people in this room are mandatory reporters if you work at Stanford. We have mandatory reporter laws that apply like at the student like college level as well. That ACM research I mentioned actually, was done by people who work at a university, and they said we're mandatory reporters. It kind of got in the way of potentially trying to do our interviews because what if something is disclosed to us that we then have to report? So it's something that certainly I think some people who work on this issue are thinking about at the college level, but I'm not aware yet of any research focusing specifically on the college context. Although there has been a big nationwide push for many years at this point to get the kinds of what previously got called revenge porn laws and what now are more the non-consensual intimate imagery laws get passed state by state by state, and then more recently with Take It Down. So I'm not clear on what it is, but certainly the lessons that I was suggesting for like schools and school districts, I think apply per force in the college context as well. It's just so much more difficult because when we're talking about anybody who's underage, it's just very cut and dried. This constitutes unprotected speech. It constitutes child pornography. It has extremely serious consequences legally for anybody who's found in possession of it. It's just completely radioactive. And all of the issues that you get into when you're talking about adults are a lot harder. Like the previous questioner said, the big problem with this isn't that it's pornography, it's that it's non-consensual. And that's where the focus, I think, needs to be.
And then we had a follow-up on the section in your talk where you mentioned recommendations for or at the K through 12 level for administrators and educators and how to combat this. For educators that are teaching or intending to teach AI ethics, do you have any sort of specific recommendations for those educators into how to integrate sort of reflections on this into that particular line of work?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't have like childhood education expertise, so I don't want to tell people how to do their jobs, particularly when it comes to the question of, do we call out nudify apps specifically? I think there is something to be said for AI ethics and just general, like the respect approach of maybe through a bullying framing of saying like whatever like mean image you might make of somebody else using AI, that's still not okay. It's still not appropriate. It's not respectful to the other person. On top of all of the broader ways that I think schools can be trying to educate kids, not just about ethics, but interrelated questions of AI literacy, about how to try and determine whether an image is real or not. Obviously, some of this is not necessarily meant to be taken as being real, but there are situations where maybe it could be. The ACM research I mentioned interviewed teachers who said, well, what if somebody wants to make this to make it sound like they were able to sleep with this other student? They've got these nude pictures of this other student, and now they're just lying about that. That is a potential fact pattern where it is being held out as real. And so I think there are AI ethics questions that can conjoin very neatly with the kinds of what are the telltale signs of a deep fake? How do we try and figure out whether information or imagery is reliable, that I'm sure a lot of schools are trying to deal with. And one of the other things that I think has come out of our research and other research on this topic is just how slammed every teacher is with how many things they have to do and teach and account for. This is one more thing. The more that they can try and put this under the larger umbrella of AI instruction itself, great, but I also want to just sort of call out and recognize that when you're dealing with cheating and lesson plans and the 1 million things that state law already imposes on you that you have to do and how many instructional minutes you have to teach per year, et cetera, this is going to be one more thing on top of all that. I do not envy the task of trying to fit this in alongside all of those other things they're trying to do in grappling with AI.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about when you reference sextortion and how it's more targeted at boys than what you're seeing now, that this is pretty much exclusively boy against girl. And I'm sort of curious about that gender differentiation, and if you think that it's just a matter of time for this sextortionist to catch up with.
It's a good question. I don't, because I haven't studied that extensively. I don't know why it is that teenage boys are more commonly targeted than teenage girls. Whether there's some difference in terms of the amount of shame that a boy might feel at being either fooled or having something disclosed about him. Certainly, the thing that differentiates the cyber criminals who engage in sextortion from these other fact patterns of student on student, or who are adult pedophilic offenders or whatever, is that there's just a monetary motivation. And so whatever works to make money with the least amount of effort is something that cyber criminals will chase down and start to engage in. And so we'll have to see whether passage of more laws or other types of intervention efforts or detection efforts does more to try and dissuade them. But I think you are right that we can expect that they will try and shift tactics if one becomes less effective and potentially another becomes more effective. One of the things that's come out of other research on this topic is noting that when somebody pressures a girl to send a nude image, it might not necessarily be for sextortion purposes. It might just be they feel pressured in their intimate relationship, by their boyfriend or by whoever they think that they're digitally dating online. And so there may also just be different psychological reasons why that may make girls more susceptible or less susceptible than boys to different types of influences or different types of norms, and trying to normalize sexualized behavior and the sharing of sexual images, whether that's nudes or fake things. So it's basically all just to say it's a good question. These sorts of cybercrime gangs are very reactive and responsive and evolving in terms of their techniques, but that there may be psychological reasons or social reasons for the difference in boys versus girls being more or less receptive to this kind of pressure that I simply have not studied myself.